what I would like to share with you this evening, early evening, is maybe a bit of really both about my own experience of coming from an Islamic theological background, but really ending up becoming an educator, a Muslim educator. And I was originally trained in Sharia, in Islamic law, at the University of Ankara Divinity School. And I had a scholarship to the UK to do some postdoctoral research. But when I ended up in Birmingham, it was the first time I was visiting the UK. It was like revelation. So I couldn't believe, of course, the complexity of Muslims from South Asia in Birmingham. And I was supposed to be doing something on Islamic law and maqasid and the fine details of Islamic philosophy of law. But I went and visited, of course, the mosque and madrasa and the Islamic seminaries, and seeing the young generation of British Muslims struggling to make sense of Islam in their lives. I thought probably I'm just wasting my time. So I switched my major to education and social sciences, and which obviously was a career change, really. I'm glad that I did that. So it's a bit of a personal biography to set the scene as to how I ended up looking at Islam and educational issues within the context of British Islam, to which obviously both I am an insider and an outsider, because I come from a background from Turkey, but obviously British Islam is predominantly South Asian. So it was a very interesting, exciting process, and I was lucky to be able to actually research it as well. Our focus for tonight really is to look at the relationship between education in Islam and obviously the formation, construction of religious authority. And that is an important thing because obviously without an authority, we wouldn't be able to have competent guidance to guide Muslims in general and young people in particular in the challenging context that we are in. So there's a relationship between formation of certain types of religious authority and the educational processes and institutions that are actually obviously forming this authority. So it will be a bit of a critical reflection, so I would try to raise the concern that I had all along, and obviously we'll have a time for you to reply and to share your own agreement or disagreements. So my outline is basically 3 or 4 really major subtopics. Well, obviously, first of all, we have to look at whether there is such a kind of a problem, a crisis, to do with religious authority and leadership within the British Muslim communities. Some people may say everything is fine, we don't really need to have any debate or discussion. So I would spend a little bit of time trying to contextualize this problem. Is it real or imagined? Is there a crisis within the religious leadership and religious authority that we have in British Islam and of course in Europe generally? And if so, obviously there must be a complex baggage of issues related to this problem. What I would like to focus is actually the educational and pedagogic aspect of this crisis within within religious authority. And obviously, if hopefully my argument by then makes sense to all of you, the question would be, of course, we don't need to spend all of our time analyzing it. How do you respond to this challenge? How do we make it sure that we have a competent and a meaningful Islamic religious authority, in a sense, developing within this new context that we are in? And here I will share with you, for me, probably the key element which is still missing would be investment in understanding or rethinking the Islamic education and the meaning of education in Islam, both in the informal sense, but also in the formal sense. Because there is a link between the types of religious authorities that are around and the kind of educational pedagogic culture that produces it. So we have to look at how a rethink of Islam education in Islam, and particularly a transformative Islamic education model, which I believe I have advanced and developed that I could offer, could actually maybe be one of the vital investment areas in the long run, both for the Muslim communities, but as well as for the wider society to invest in. And the idea would be that this kind of transformative Islamic educational institutions or philosophies, if you like, practices, will really develop competences to enable a contextual, indigenized Islamic authority to prosper. And as a result, to be able to obviously competently guide Muslim young people to develop an intelligent self-understanding as young Muslims, and hopefully to become part of maybe a much intelligent expression of Islam in Britain and wider Europe. So that is the sort of promise of this kind of transformative Islamic education. Okay, I'm sorry it's a little bit too long. I just tried to condense down my arguments into short sentences in case later on you want to just look at the PowerPoints basically. But I'll try to summarize. Excuse me. The main problematic. Now, I believe that there is a crisis within current religious leadership and authority in the UK and in the wider context of really European Islam. And the reasons for this obviously is tied to obviously the post-Second World War migration. And if I just put story very briefly, and I know of course some of you are studying ethnography and history of that whole unfolding story of British Islam, to put it in a very short way, the first generations obviously arrive as guest workers. The idea is to return back to home when they made enough money. But then the return to home becomes a myth. They make enough money, but then they simply build houses in Pakistan or in India. But then the families are joined back. Once the families are joined, obviously second generation and the third generation brings along the issues of values and identity. In other words, the first generation most likely knew who they were, of course, and maybe they were not too much religiously literate people because they came for work, obviously, manual work. But in the life of second and third generation young people, when they obviously came along, the key issue was, right, how do we manage to maintain a healthy Islamic identity, Islamic values in the life of our young generations? And also there is this perceived challenge from the secular culture. There's kind of a fear that our young people will be negatively influenced by secular culture. And this is a story, of course, isn't it? Mosque building, opening up Islamic cultural, religious centers, up until obviously establishing Islamic higher education institutions like seminaries, Darul Ulooms. Now, obviously, all this happens in a way that it is kind of transplanted, isn't it? It kind of taken from a context in subcontinent and replanted in the context of secular, multicultural context. And the agents of that translation, of that kind of movement, were obviously religious authorities, scholars, who obviously represented certain affiliations, certain movements, certain kind of interpretations of Islam. And the idea was they would be actually leading these institutions in the UK. Now, you can see, of course, immediately some of the problems, because obviously these people, religious leaders who were imams and scholars who came over here, they didn't really spend time to studying, life in the UK, let's find out what's going on in the UK. They kind of had a package of religious literacy, religious identity, and the idea was they were creating institutions really to replicate identity narratives that are brought, of course, from the countries of origin of the parents. So you can immediately see that there will be an intergenerational difference between the kind of religious leadership in these institutions and the kind of needs and expectations of young Muslims growing up in a completely different context. And obviously, as the young generations came along, it became very clear there was not only a language problem growing. Most of the imams, religious scholars, would use, obviously, Urdu and other languages, but young people will increasingly find it difficult to be fluent in these languages. So gradually you will have that kind of intergenerational change taking place. And immediately you will realize the religious leadership is really not interested in finding out the changing patterns of the needs of the young people. So the expectation will be, of course, young people just following them, basically. The other problem was the educational pedagogic culture in these institutions, where obviously what I would call in many ways teacher text-centered rather than learner-centered. So you would have scholars, obviously, and certain texts who deemed to be very sacred. So the idea would be to master this body of sacred knowledge with a great master, and then emulate. Now, obviously, if you're a young person born in the UK context, that is quite difficult. I mean, you could still do it out of devotion and spirituality, but clearly, the kind of the leadership within these institutions were really not interested in the changing reality on the grounds in many ways. Now, obviously, coupled with this, you've got issues to do with Islamophobia, obviously racism, and the kind of thing that we already are familiar, that obviously the wider society were showing. So in many ways, we can say that the third dimension, this internationally operating Islamic revivalist movement, you have to look at the wider Islamic story as well in the Islamic world. There was a post-colonial reality. People are responding to that reality by renewing and reforming Islam. So in other words, you have, of course, internationally operating international Islamic networks and movements. And they have, obviously, a vested interest in the religious agency and authority of the community. And that interest, obviously, doesn't always really innocently reflect what Islam requires. And we have to be quite vigilant on this. And on the other hand, you have, of course, the wider government, a post-Christian, highly secularized state, where obviously faith really doesn't play too much a big role, trying to make sense of these migrants within the ethnicity and race framework. This is very interesting. So the whole research comes in the 70s and 60s, it's all to do with the race. They don't realize the fact that Muslims may come from diverse racial language backgrounds, but Islam acts as the kind of center of their collective identity. So there was really a kind of this interest among the policymakers to understand how faith will play a role in the lives of particularly young people. And obviously, between these two kind of dilemmas, you can see that how the community will struggle. Already have got so much lack of infrastructure, plenty of demands, but how do they perform? How do they actually meet these expectations? So you can see that religious authority not always really rise up to challenge, to guide the community, but try to insulate in many ways because they want to inscribe the way in which they saw the authentic Islam identity should be all about. So in many ways, the religious authorities nurtured the kind of, obviously, Islamic identities that obviously will be following the way in which they will portray Islam in many ways. There wasn't really much time to think or rethink how Islam could be contextualized, how could we look at this difficult challenge that Muslims have never encountered, like secular culture and the changing needs of young Muslims. And the idea was that you simply safeguard these young people and the community by obviously creating this kind of insular state. Now, I would say one more thing in terms of the policymakers. With the hindsight, we know that Europeans have acted differently. In France, you have assimilation model. In the UK, you've got the multiculturalism, which was a kind of a naive, interesting policy development. The idea was, as long as people are not really making any problems, cultures could live side by side. There's no need to be critical of each other. So, of course, we call this kind of a naive multiculturalism. That didn't work, of course, in the long run. It was very much accommodating maybe the claims of identities of Muslims, but in the long run, it created obviously a problem that we are now facing with. The final point is, of course, the rise of religious extremism and the rise of course, international violence and Islam. And in many ways, if somebody was genuinely following on the ground the stories of British Islam, European Islam, the kind of rigid identities that our young people are ended up with, unfortunately, would not be really a surprise. But many people did not really took interest in identifying and understanding how young Muslims will make sense of their religious agency. Plenty of research was all about, again, ethnicity and different aspects of their being, but not empirical studies of faith. That was exactly when I myself ended up in Birmingham, and I've decided to actually conduct a short research on the kind of attitudes of young British Muslims towards Islam, and to look at their identity structure, their faith development issues. And we developed a kind of a semi-structured interview framework to actually understand that whole complex religious life world of these young people. I'll be sharing with you in a minute. So to summarize, I think there is a problem religious authority, its formation out of a very traditional teacher text-centered framework borrowed from the subcontinent, dominated the scene in the UK context, and wasn't really interested in competently guiding, but trying to really recruit in many ways young people to their own causes, basically. Now, we will look at what is in Islam religious authority briefly, theologically as well, legally as well, of course. Where does authority lie according to Islam? Is it individuals? Is it institutions? Often we hear that, of course, Islam doesn't have a church-like structure, which is true. But it doesn't mean in Islam we don't have formation of religious authority. We do have, of course. But what is structure is crucial to find out. The final point about this is, while particularly the theological seminaries where they obviously embedded religious authority, they themselves came out of a reform tradition, for example, i.e. 17th, 18th century Deoband reform in India. It's interestingly enough that reform comes out of a previous, obviously, challenge that in Indian context Muslims encountered. Like with the colonialism, we've got secular education, and in India, you've got university like Aligarh, which was originally based on a very secular framework. And you've got obviously Muslims trying to respond to that in Indian context, and Deoband reform comes along. But in the UK, when these institutions are transplanted in the UK, they themselves become traditions. So when you say, for example, why is it that we should train our faith leaders through certain texts that are decided in 18th century by Maulana Nizamuddin, that's Nizami, people say, no, almost it's like a sacred agreement. But then we say, look, actually, this Maulana Nizamuddin was a great guy. He was a reformer in many ways. He reformed that tradition in India. So he put together this curriculum. He really never meant to be training of muftis and Muslim scholars. It was really a different purpose. In many ways, people forget that actually their own narratives are based on a reform sub-tradition. But here it becomes an ideological framework that it is a tradition and full stop. Barelvi, Deobandi, Salafi, all the rest of it. So in other words, there is a kind of ahistorical thinking that unfortunately is unable to contextualize the sources, the origins of this religious authority. Therefore, it's unable to open up itself to reform and change. It doesn't mean they're all wrong. It means basically it's a bit of difficult to really make them to obviously reflect contextually where they come from. But it's always easy, obviously, to have the sacred status and, of course, insist on its authenticity. But we will see that in Islam, actually, you have to justify the authority in many ways. Anyway, so if we don't have to look at other issues like, what does Islam say about the women and human rights and complex issues that are with us today. We know that if you look at studies, people have done some studies of some of the fatwas, that means learned opinions, legally non-binding opinions came out of some of our religious scholars in the UK. Obviously, it's very difficult to tally with the fundamental values of Islam, unfortunately. So we know that this religious authority is really, it's kind of creating, in a sense, black and white picture, rather than trying to guide the community in these volatile, difficult times by trying to really be following a common sense, following a really need-centered, if you like, the approach. Okay, I don't want to spend too much on this. So the actual educational culture in the institutions, in my view, is a major contributor of sort of lack of producing competent new Islamic faith leadership in the UK context, because we don't have time to unpack it, of course. The educational culture that is feeding that has been borrowed from the subcontinent, of course. As we say, it is almost reducing the study of Islam in study of certain texts. And there's nothing wrong with textual studies, by the way. But if you're unable to contextualize the sciences that they go with it, you end up spending 10 years simply mastering one or two texts within a large body of knowledge and science. So in many ways, the kind of educational pedagogic practices are no longer creating reflective, grounded faith leaders, basically. And we know this because I will now share. I mean, I've been teaching at Markfield now. This is my 9th year, and a program which is called Ahmed in Islamic Education. And the people who apply for this program, as 90% come from Darul Uloom graduates. They're very gifted young people with all absolute wonderful competencies. And always, the reality is they come up and they make the statement, they had only maybe 30% of those who attended this intensive study, they actually managed to find their own voices. So in other words, we have a system at the higher education level where we really need to be enabling young Muslims to be able to ground themselves in complex Islamic sciences, but also understand the context. On the contrary, they are really spending a lot of time simply trying to decode complicated, maybe commentary tradition or maybe gloss traditions, hashiyas basically. So in other words, there is a pedagogic really question, and I will come to this because extension of that sort of transmission, instruction-centered teaching reflects itself when it comes to teaching Islam in, let us say, an informal Islamic education setting, like a madrasa, a mosque, or an Islamic school, where when we look at the output of that education, we realize there are dangers, and I would say why. Because now we have ways of assessing the impact of pedagogic methods are used and the content used to teach Islam to young Muslims in British context, and the kind of religious agency, the kind of faith development they actually develop. That is the heart of the issue. In many ways, we don't really want to say too much, be critical of this specific teaching and learning culture. If we had evidence suggesting that it's actually producing well-rounded young people with deep understanding of Islam and obviously with a healthy, intelligent Islamic faith development, probably we would just rest our case. But this is not the case as far as we have the empirical studies concerned. I will share some of them with you. So often there is obviously this kind of disembodied ahistorical teaching of Islam, and there is almost no interest about the outside world, where obviously the faith leaders will operate. And therefore, of course, there isn't much really, ultimately, development of this mature faith development taking place within this as a result of this educational culture. Now, I said that I had a model of trying to assess the impact of whatever Islamic education that they've gone through, young people. And this model is, just briefly put it, is had psychosocial framework. It's based on idea that we should differentiate between religion and religiosity. So religion is, isn't it, the body of sacred texts, traditions are inherited. But religiosity is a psychosocial concept. That means the way in which individuals, groups experience religion. And you can actually study that religiosity. You don't have to be a theologian to understand this. And I developed a framework which is called Muslim Subjektivity Interview Schedule, which is basically consisted of one questionnaire. It's called You and Your Faith Attitude Towards Islam Scale, where basically you agree, disagree with certain statements, and you have a religious practice. How often do you pray, for example? But then you have a semi-structured interview where you look at the actual identity structure. Now, obviously, in order this model to make sense to the Muslim educators and Muslim scholars, obviously I had to relate that this is obviously not kind of an infidel way of doing things. You have to kind of justify within the Islamic grounds. And when we look at the classical Islamic self-understanding, you realize, obviously, great scholars of Islam have classified Islam into several categories. One, they call it, obviously, the i'tiqad, the essential articles of faith. You've got worship, ibadat, and you've got, of course, social interactions, and, of course, the morals. So you've got teachings related to all of these aspects. So in other words, how an individual or a group interprets these several categories in their life should be able to tell us the religiosity, the devotion and spirituality of that person. Now, the model that I just mentioned, it has a questionnaire. You measure their attitudes, look at the religious practice, but then you have actually an identity model to understand the structure of faith development. And that is based on the idea that if you have a sense of identity of any kind, you have to have a commitment, presence of a commitment. You could be committed to human rights. You could be committed to a cause, which basically means you have an identification. But if this commitment has not undergone an exploration, reflection, the chances are you will have a very strong identity, but psychosocially it will be unfortunately called foreclosed. It will be basically inward-looking, and it will not be really, obviously, reflective. So people sometimes, of course, tend to underestimate this. When you have a strong identity, the assumption is you are a very, sort of clear person. But psychosocially, it doesn't really mean having an identity structure makes you a healthy person. You could be a very, isn't it, black and white person. The 4 claws would have different shades up until the level of indoctrination. So having commitment in itself does not guarantee that that commitment is facilitating a healthy development of the individual. Now, on the opposite, if that commitment shows signs of exploration, reflection, moratorium basically, that there's a space, the person is looking at evidence, thinking twice, saying maybe I am wrong, maybe I will look at the evidence. If that process is there and the person has done this process, which usually it is obviously adolescent period in human life, you will have a kind of psychosocially achieved status of identity. So you will have an identification commitment where you also exhibit some degree of reflection, consideration, and contextualization. And obviously, you may not be interested in, let us say, religious issues. That means you will be diffused in that kind of area. Yeah? Now, obviously, we don't have time to explain the whole model, but it's a practical model where you can actually, with the Islamic content, to actually assess the attitudes, the kind of commitments that young Muslims have. Now, I had to invent this in many ways by looking at the tradition of psychology of religion, mostly, and developmental psychology, because in Birmingham, when I was doing my research, I was trying to look at young sixth form college Muslim young people. And obviously, they were in the adolescent years, and the idea was, in developmental psychology, this is the period of time in their life where they search actively about personal agency and identity. So in other words, I had to really develop such a model to be able to actually make sense where these young Muslims are in terms of their faith development. Okay, now just to briefly tell you the results of that journey, of that first empirical study. We had roughly 500 people in the sample, and it was obviously the innocent world of before 9/11, by the way. So there wasn't, in fact, it was difficult to convince people to take part in this study because everybody was saying, we are all okay with each other, there's no problem. The results were interesting. 90% of attitude scores were very high. But the religious practice showed discrepancy, as young people would show less involvement in religious practice. So there was huge attitude. That means young people were very inspired to be Muslim. But when you looked at the religious practice, like let us say performance of prayer 5 times, there was a decline. You could see the age group from 16 below would be less observing, and those who are above 20 were observing. And then when you unpack the type of religiosities, that was interesting. Actually, most of the young male would fall under different shades of 4 clause identity or religiosity. And there will be a growing number of diffused young people who would obviously say, I just really have nothing to do with Islam. It's just my parents' culture, baggage. I have to just pretend that I'm a Muslim, basically. Now, that was very interesting. The results were very telling because you could see that 4th generation of young Muslims in the context of Britain, they were still making a big claim about their religious heritage. They didn't really clearly, when you unpacked why they are 4 clause, you could see that they did not have chance to a critical Islamic educational provision. And therefore, those who were very sincerely observant, they were simply exhibiting a following, a kind of a 4 clause mindset, because my parents do, because my peer does. And when you say, why you are a Muslim on your own ground, why do you pray? You would have less intelligent accounts of why they pray, for example. So there was a less kind of a personal presence in their religiosity. Now, obviously, that was very interesting finding. As I said, the idea was, in a context of Birmingham, where schools would have 90% Muslim kids, if you have this 4 clause identity, and if you have this, if you like, in many ways, dual identities, because often young people would say, I go home, I'm a different person. I go to my parents, I'm a different person. The idea would be, what would happen to these young people, particularly the 4 clause category? Because when I used to ask them, if you have a problem, a religious problem, who do you go to? Do you go to the imam? They would say, no. They don't speak my language, English enough. So where do you go and get your religious ideas from? Well, we've got private study circles. We've got XYZ groups. Obviously, they felt that the community, the mosque, represented a very irrelevant traditional account of Islam, whereas reform and internationally operating networks, that kind of revival Islam, was much more capturing their imagination, attracting them because they were promising sense of uniqueness. So I could see that the religious agency of these young people is really going to be causing them problems if, obviously, we don't intervene. So I was very lucky that in Birmingham at that time, we had a very great RE team. The results were very telling. Of course, we said we had to do something to these young people. We had no clue, of course, what would come in after 9/11. The idea was, when you look at the educational culture behind the foreclosed mindset, you could see that this transmission, instruction-centered training framework was one of the key culprits of that formation of foreclosed identity. The idea was, okay, what is really education in Islam? What does it mean to be educated in Islam? If really Islam says you got to really basically indoctrinate yourself and train yourself, obviously we have no option to just follow and to go with that framework. This is where obviously I myself began to think what really education is in Islam. I have only 10 minutes, I know, but I will try to summarize. Why is it that actually there's a need to rethink the education, what education is in Islam? Because informal and formal Islamic education institutions where religious authorities are embedded are still reluctant to think twice what they do in terms of inculcating, transmitting Islam, where there is obviously no almost respect for the agency of the learner. Now, in order to convince this, obviously I said, well, okay, you think in Islam probably indoctrination is the best model of education. I said, well, convince me. What is your evidence? This is where, of course, I got my, in a sense, window of opportunity. Because when I asked them what is real education in Islam, it became very clear not many of them had actually interest or understanding of what education in Islam. They had a vocabulary, for example, the word tarbiyah and adab are used, or tazkiyah or ta'aruf. These are all Arabic words which are very significant parts of Islamic educational, basically, thinking. But they will never really engage in the implications of this word. I'll just take only one example to illustrate as to why what they were doing in terms of Islamic education and training was completely remotely not reconcilable with Islamic, at least definition within the core sources. Take the word tarbiyah, which is commonly used word in Islamic culture to mean education in Islam. But tarbiyah is an adab, these two words. Adab is used as a kind of a moral disciplining and manners and etiquettes. In fact, ta'adib means disciplining. And tarbiyah comes from an Arabic word, which is very interesting. It has three possible roots. In Arabic, the words, they go to the original verbal sort of origins. In Arabic, of course, we have got rabba yarbu, rabiya yarbu, and rabba yarubbu. That means to increase, to develop, to nurture, to guide, to reform, and to give, to care, to briefly put. So education in Islam, by this definition, cannot be but a process of development, facilitating, nurturing, giving care, and guiding someone to fulfill their potentials as human beings. So when I put this, of course, to these great Maulanas and Ulamas, they kind of said, well, what really, is it true? I said, well, okay, let me, because they like textual scholarship. So I chose an 11th century great scholar, those who've studied Islamic studies would know, Raghab al-Asfahani, a great scholar who lived in Persia. Because, of course, the Persian didn't know Arabic, he had to make it sure that people understand the Quran. So he has written a wonderful dictionary, is a kind of a short, really, aid to study the Quran. And he has kind of entries of every single word in the Quran to just describe it. When it comes to word Rabb, which is related, basically Rabb means obviously Lord and God, actually it's related to Tarbiyah. He has an entry, it says, Ar-Rabb fil asli at-Tarbiyah. He says Rabb actually means education. An 11th century scholar, 12th century scholar using the word Tarbiyah, which is quite modern. And he says, Tarbiyah is, so what is education? He says, Insha'u shay'i, to facilitate, to build up something, halan fa halan, step by step, Insha'u shay'i halan fa halan ila haddi tamam, until that thing fulfills its potential. So for Raghab al-Asfahani, education meant a transformative dialogical process of growing and developing into being human, including, of course, faith development. It cannot be a simple process of knowledge transmission, memorization, isn't it? And a ritualistic take on basically knowledge, a kind of a banking model of education. So obviously, and that's why you understand that Quran has a very specific, real definition of what education is. And the great scholars have noted this. It's not because I am noting it. So that transformative, human-centered model of being educated in different aspects of human life has completely lost its meaning in this context. This is what we really need to give to our teachers and our religious authorities to function. If God, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Ar-Rab, that means He wants to depict Himself as an educator par excellence. Why? Because God says, we've created you, we've given you a gift of life. However, we know that your nafs, didn't have a time to explain, human soul, human personality, you have bad and good inclinations. So I'm going to help you out, to reach out to you, to be able to actually make you think, so that you can actually find the reason behind the creation and hopefully express that gratitude by worshipping me alone. Within the Quranic context, actually it makes all sense. So God is not really trying to spoon feed or trying to sort of one way put knowledge into your brain. No, the Quran is saying, well, actually, I want to listen to you as humanity, and I want to actually attend to your needs, all of your concerns, and then I want to really make you think. So thinking becomes an important Quranic pedagogy, which obviously those who have studied Quran would know this. Through actually reflection and thinking, Quran says, you would be able to grasp that meaning and hopefully express your gratitude to me, and that will be great, obviously. So therefore, there could be some people who do not actually listen to this story. Well, the Quran says the Prophet, peace be upon him, you should not be insisting on people to convert in this sense. If they wish to resist, not to acknowledge, not to be grateful, that's fine. If they wish to remain as a great, ungrateful humanity, leave it. Your task is to basically educate and to tell. So in other words, I didn't realize that most of the Muslim educators and scholars have left an educational engagement with the Quran. So there is no, what I call, educational hermeneutics applied to Islam. As a result, whatever educational theories we deduce, we discern, are simple instructions, devotional materials, but actually it's kind of loading onto people to just do something. It is not the other way around. It doesn't really facilitate growth into humanity. So therefore, of course, people's agency doesn't develop. Therefore, of course, people obviously do not find depth meaning into, of course, Islamic tradition. Results, of course, expression of anger and complicated problems. In a foreclosed mindset, what do you do? And of course, gradually, the foreclosed mindset leads into sometimes, unfortunately, violence. Now, I don't have time again to illustrate. Hopefully, in the discussion, maybe we'll have. So my methodic study of Quran from an educational framework revealed interesting insights. And I would just simply summarize. For example, you would say that one of the important points of, obviously, educating humanity is obviously to have the benefit of doubt or even skepticism. You would be surprised to see in the Quran, doubt is used as a methodic educational instrument to be able to facilitate growth into knowledge. Great example is the story of Ibrahim alayhi salam. Of course, the fact that the Quran is mostly in the form of stories itself tells us how powerful the Quran takes education seriously. So there are examples after examples, of course, beginning with Muhammad ﷺ himself. There's a prophetic education of Muhammad ﷺ because he was full of concern that he was misguided. The Quran actually educates Muhammad ﷺ in his new role. But the Quran is suggesting that in human condition, doubt is a possibility, but this doubt could actually be utilized as an educational resource to facilitate higher learning. The story of Ibrahim al-Abraham, when he was trying to discover, of course, meaning in life and God, in his later life, we have passages in the Quran where obviously he becomes a prophet. He gains the confidence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, God. He becomes a very close friend. Therefore, Khalilullah, we call in Islamic tradition, friend of God. Of course, one day he walks in a valley, he sees these dead animals. They are kind of completely been kind of wiped out. And of course, suddenly he says to himself, oh God, how are you going to recreate, resurrect these dead bodies in the hereafter? The passage says, oh Abraham, don't you trust in my power? Very interesting dialogue. And Abraham says, of course, I have no doubt you are so powerful. لِيَطْمَئِنَّ قَلْبِي. I just want to satisfy my human heart. Now the Quran doesn't say, okay, you have to stop here. The Quran goes on to say, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is illustrating examples for Abraham to be able to actually convince him that the kind of regeneration of life is possible by giving example after example. Here we have God qualifying his authority in respect for the human agency. And the classical Islamic scholars say they call this rububiyya quality. That means God acts with humanity through an educational care framework. Now, obviously, if you take all this seriously, you realize that religious authority is not there to simply insist on some rigid ideological points, irresponsible points, but actually to be able to have ethical responsibility of guiding young people to be able to obviously find the truth and, of course, fulfill their potentials in a meaningful way. So, in other words, if we do not change the educational culture within our institutions, the chances are we will not be able to actually be catalysts of developing a mature Islamic self-expressions. I didn't have time to go into the character of religious authority in Islam. Just briefly, it's an embodied ethical presence where the quality, the kind of the authority of the scholar is justified, qualified. In Islam, there is no such thing as, because I come from X, Y, Z tradition, I'm authority. The authority is qualified with, obviously, sincerity, devotion, but also, most crucially, it is interpretive and it's actually communal in nature, i.e., you have to master certain scholarship, so your scholarship should qualify your authority, but then you can simply impose this on people. You've got to have people being able to follow you, communal aspect. So ijtihad, in a sense, interpretation, you could put forward, but if you don't have people who are convinced, your authority will not work out. So there's a communal and interpretive aspect of religious authority in Islam, which goes into Quranic educational vision overall. So it's kind of authoritative acting and knowing that actually is encouraged, which goes along with this transformative educational model. Now I say this because today, on the one hand, we have got these very rigid foreclosed religious authorities, but because of the political context, there is a rush to create politically correct Islamic authorities, which is very sad, of course. In other words, there's extremism, but the response is too much security-led. People have got no time to think things that I'm suggesting. So the idea is then, it's easy, if you can't transform society, just simply produce an alternative. Create politically correct Islamic authority and obviously support it so that they could actually basically create a kind of a secular version of Islamic sense to develop. Now, I say this because this is becoming increasingly reality, and our traditional scholarship is unable to really tackle with these complicated, politically manufactured developments. I mean, just last week I attended a meeting about the exam time and the fasting provision in the UK, which is obviously going to be quite difficult this year for some children, Muslim children, to be able to observe fast. It might well affect their performance. It was interesting. We had 25 people in the room, and we have traditional scholars, but we had, interestingly, it's a kind of a semi-governmental body that is doing this. It was very interesting to see how that body was privileging a kind of a Islamic religious authority that was simply really, in my view, acting not based on knowledge or respect or responsibility. The idea was, for example, that Islam is a religion of peace and mercy. We should simply say, obviously, just don't fast. But I said, well, where is the Islamic legal framework in Islam? Yes, we have mercy and we have compassion, but we have, the authority has to be qualified with religious scholarship. Now, the idea was, I said, look, first of all, fasting in classical Islam, correct me if I'm wrong, Mansour, is part of, he's our authority now, is what I remember from my study is actually part of what we call ibadat. That means it's a part of worship, article of worship. Essentially, we have to recognize fasting is really between you and God. Scholars say this is a part of God's rights. So it's between you and God. But there are certain exemptions that are actually in the Quran itself. For example, if you are ill, if you are traveling, the point is God doesn't want you to suffer unnecessarily. Now, I said, look, in Islam, fasting is, we say tawqifi. That means you have to stop. Fasting could have so many good benefits, but you cannot say because of these benefits we are fasting. We fast, we pray, because above all else, God demands from us. It's God's right. Now, this chap was saying, well, because we are living in the UK and because, of course, days are very long, and Islam is a religion of peace, and we just simply, it's better to say not to fast. Well, I said, well, why don't we say, as Muslims, parents and schools, we have this flexibility in Islamic law. If anybody wants to benefit from this flexibility, they should. They should not be forcing children to fast, but they should not obviously have this sense as if it's a kind of an optional stuff. In other words, I could see that the 25 people, the traditional Muslim scholars, were unable to raise their voice because the perception was there was a kind of a politically correct view already expressed. In fact, it insisted maybe even we should simply reduce the hours of fasting to, let us, for example, 12 hours or 10 hours. I said, well, why not fast? So in other words, we don't want to end up with simplistic, politically correct Islamic religious authorities that are clearly not feeling the responsibility of authoritatively guiding the community, basically. Now, this is a bit of an anecdote, but I think it's a kind of a telling picture because on the one hand, we have a very foreclosed, let us say, Salafi, Ahl Hadith literalism, with all respect to those who subscribe to this. But on the other hand, I realize we are waking up to the reality of a secular liberal literalism. Surely Islam is a religion of balance. We have to have somewhere in between. And that in between is not there. And this is really unfortunate for a religion which is based on sense of balance and sense of actually respecting the authority of God and, of course, the agency of human beings. Okay, so just that is really what I want to say. Ultimately, what we want to see is we want to have these transformative Islamic educational teachings are understood, are practiced within our institutions, in my view. And we have to train Muslim scholars in terms of pedagogic formation, which is missing again. You could be a great scholar, but you could always act within a legal framework. That doesn't make you a great teacher. There is an urgency in Europe particularly that we need to set up Muslim teacher training colleges. Muslims are very happy to set up Muslim schools, hundreds. But they don't understand you've got to have qualified teachers to be able to run these institutions. And as a result, we have schools, we have Darul Ulooms run by unqualified educators, unfortunately. And result, foreclosed mindsets are reproduced. So we need to look at this whole education in Islam, and we have to prioritize, in my view, urgently, the training of Muslim faith leaders and Muslim educators. If we could actually make a difference in their lives, if they could become competent, the chances are they will really make a difference to the life of our young people. Thank you very much. Jazakumullah khair. Wa akhir da'wana alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen.